So, good morning. Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Shayla, can you hear me? Okay, good. Thank you. So let's go ahead and begin with some prayers. Shayla's going to put those on the screen and I'll lead you in those prayers today. So again, we'll recite refuge the first time in English and then twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu pardu dakni kyapsu chi daki chunyan gi pe soknam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shok sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu pardu dakni kyapsu chi Daki Chunyan Gipe Soknam Gi Drola Panchir Sangye Druparsho. Okay, great, thank you, Shaila. Let's do a short meditation. Again, just spend the first few minutes focusing on the breath. I probably don't need to give you much instruction on that, but whatever mode that you choose to work with the breath, just try to keep your awareness there. And whenever the mind wanders, and just gently guide the mind back to the breath. So we'll do this in silence for just a few minutes, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation for today's class. So now let's set our motivation for today. Let's do this by reflecting briefly on some of what I covered last Sunday. And we're embarking in this course on a study of how to use our problems, difficulties, suffering, and transform it into the path. To turn these arrows, these painful experiences, into flowers, into something that adorns us, that beautifies us. So reflect right now on those things that you have in your life right now or recently in your life that were painful or difficult for you to experience. We each have things that have caused us physical pain, mental anguish, and just bring those to mind. And while the goal continues to be throughout our Buddhist path to eliminate all of our suffering, all of our difficulties, as long as we have these experiences in our lives, we need to see them as very rich opportunities. We need to be able to extract some meaning, some purpose from having to endure these experiences, to be able to utilize them, to enhance our own minds. So the instruction that we went through last week in particular was to be able to see these through that lens, to see that simply calling them problems and having a mind that wants to avoid them, perhaps even gets angry or upset at having to experience them, that this isn't fruitful. Instead, we have to see them through that light of being perfect opportunities for us to engage in deepening our practice, developing deeper understanding of the stages of the path. So this is our motivation for being here in terms of this course, to further investigate the techniques to transform these problems and difficulties into realizations. But we do this with the greater motivation of being able to develop our minds completely to achieve our own complete enlightenment, Buddhahood, that state where we will have achieved our own welfare, our own perfection. But we do this primarily so that we can help others to do that same work. We open our hearts with great compassion and love for all beings and a desire to help them to achieve their greatest potential. So bring this mind of bodhicitta that aspires to become a Buddha for the sake of all beings into your heart right now. And we'll continue to explore this topic of Mahayana mind training, transforming our problems into the path. And you can open your eyes fully, and we'll begin. So again, good to see you all again today for this second class in this series on turning arrows into flowers. So again, I've been working with a text that is available at the course materials site for TNL at their website. This is by, again, Drupchen Jigme Tenpe Nyima, and a 20th century Lama, so it didn't live all that long ago, late 19th, early 20th century. Again, and these are, as I mentioned last week, these wonderful ancient Mahayana mind training practices, and in particular, this one that is focused on how do we take what is difficult and challenging in our lives and transform it. So as I said last week, and even in the meditation today, everything starts with this kind of registering something that is unpleasant. We call that suffering. We give that label to that. But what we're trying to do is go beyond that label to recognize that, yes, that is a moment of suffering. It is something that is difficult for us to experience, but it has all this potential within it. We can utilize that as a doorway for engaging in the teachings at an even deeper level. So this is what we're going to be moving into today. Still have a little bit more to work on in terms of introducing this topic. But this is the initial thought that our author sets out, and that Lama Zopa Rinpoche in his book, Transforming Problems into Happiness, that he's emphasizing. There are two main thoughts we have to generate. The very first one is to stop seeing everything that is difficult in our lives as solely a problem. Because then there's all that resistance. Then we just don't want to let that into our lives. And most of our pain is caused by that kind of fighting against what is actually happening. There's a little sutra that's in the Pali Canon that I sometimes introduce to get across this idea as well. It's not in our text, but it's actually called the Salata Sutra, the Sutra of the Arrows. And essentially what the Buddha says is there are two arrows. The very first arrow is the painful experience that we have, which is a ripening of our own past actions. We're going to be talking about that more today. That's something we don't have a whole lot of control over, right? When you get ill, or when you have a car accident, or when, you might be able to be somewhat careful to avoid those sorts of things in your life, but stuff happens, right? Shit happens, as that bumper sticker said, right? That we saw, I don't know how many years ago. Stuff happens. We have to deal with that reality. That's the first arrow. And we don't have a whole lot of choice in that. That first arrow is going to come into your life many, many times. You're going to have that experience. The second arrow is what you do mentally on the basis of the first arrow. It's like you take another arrow and start plunging it into yourself on the basis of having to experience the first one that makes it even more miserable. And this is one of the problems that we have, is we exacerbate our own suffering through the thoughts that we bring to our experiences. So this very first point that our author is making is that we have to stop seeing everything that comes in that's a first arrow solely from that perspective of it being suffering, and then putting suffering on top of suffering by thinking about it, dwelling on it, talking to all our friends about it. I can't believe what I'm going through. I can't believe what this person did to me. Da 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 da. We just, again, compound it. It's not healthy. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't relieve our suffering in any way, and it doesn't make it useful in terms of transforming our minds. So this is the point that the author is making in this very first section, is to kind of get past that, that process of changing everything that we meet that's unpleasant into something even more unpleasant. Just doesn't work, okay? So let me share, this is the slides that I was sharing last week, the very last one. Oops, I've got to get this out of my way here on my little screen. Oh, it is on the slideshow. Okay, good. I did set it up correctly. This is the last quote that I shared in class last Sunday. And this is, again, from your text at the very bottom of page 1. If we do not realize that it all depends on the way in which mind develops this habit, and instead we put the blame on external objects and situations alone, the flames of suffering, negative karma, aggression, and so on will spread like wildfire without end. This is what is called all appearances arising as enemies. I mean, essentially, this is where we have that lens of seeing everything as a problem, everything as a difficulty. So then it all starts to appear that way. Everything that we see is infused with those sorts of thoughts. This is Lama Zopa's commentary on that. I didn't have time to share this at the end of last week. Oh, I'm sorry, we do have some questions from last week. Maybe I should do those first. I'm sorry, I completely forgot about that. I had remembered it when I came in. Before we continue on, we had a couple of questions. Are those, Mary, did you have those written down somewhere, or someone else?
Yes, I put them in the chat.
Oh, they're in the chat now. Oh, wonderful. Thank you for doing that. Okay. Is it correct to understand that which we experience as a suffering moment or situation is a karmic connection, but also how our ego has perceived and processed the situation? I think that's what I'm talking about, essentially. So again, we have the ripening into that suffering experience that the Buddha called that first arrow in the Salata Sutta. And then we have kind of, again, how we are perceiving it through the lens of our ignorance, our delusions, and then working with the situation. So I think the question is actually getting exactly at what I'm talking about, that we have two kind of steps involved. You're going to be experiencing, as I said earlier, first arrows throughout your whole life, all the way up through death. I mean, death is another arrow we have to experience. This life ends with that moment of having to face separation from this life that we've become so attached to. So if we don't have skills and abilities to work with it and transform it throughout this life, then everything is going to be seen through that lens. And everything's going to arise as the enemy, arise as something unfavorable. And we just become miserable people because we drown in all of that. But there was another one, I think, from Amanda. Is Amanda here today? Oh, really? Okay. All right. Okay, same one for Amanda. Okay, good, good. Thank you, Mary. So maybe we can move on then. Let's go to Rinpoche's comments on this whole idea of things arising as the enemy. Rinpoche says, not realizing that this is our own doing, that we have trained our mind to this negative way of thinking, we point to external things, again, the cause of those first arrows, other beings or circumstances as the source of our problems. The more we think that our problems come from outside, the more our anger arises. Of course, there is the factor of whoever is involved in creating that first arrow. There are other people who do say things and do things that are challenging for us, that are suffering for us. But that's not the main reason why we are experiencing that. Again, the main source of our problems is our own karma, our own minds. But if we continue to see them in that way, as something undesirable that we want to push out of our lives and that we fight against and resist against, well, then we're only going to have more negative thoughts in our mind. Like a fire blazing as we pour more and more oil on it, our anger blazes higher and higher, bringing greater negative karma. Then unbearably great anger arises, bringing even heavier negative karma. We become angry at everything that appears to our senses, everyone and everything we see. I mean, hopefully we're not that extreme. I'm really hoping that most of you are, have been practicing the Dharma for a number of years and been able to tame your mind to some degree. But we might have those moments still where something happens. And the wonderful thing about many of these mind training texts is that they point out individual circumstances, such as those that are set out in the 8 verses of mind training. And that one that we find particularly challenging, verse 6, when someone whom I have benefited and in whom I have great hopes gives me terrible harm, I shall regard that person as my most holy guru. When we have someone who we've taken care of and benefited and done everything for, and they do something that is painful for us, right? They say something to other people about us, or they expose something about us, or that whatever the case might be. We've been nurturing and taking care of those people all our lives, and suddenly they're doing something that's really painful for us. Well, do we get angry? Do we get upset? Or do we see them as our guru? Do we see that as an amazing teaching? So once more, we might have those moments where we might think we're pretty good practitioners. I'm not getting angry and upset at the stranger on the street who says this or that. I'm not getting upset at the traffic when I go out and drive around the city. I'm not getting upset at all these various things. But then something breaks through. And suddenly it's like a thorn in our side, and we cannot get out of it, that pattern of anger. So once more, all of this is to help us to not go to those habitual places, but we do that through mind training, thought transformation, changing our thoughts. Let's go back to this. I think I'm going back to the text then after these quotes from Rinpoche. We're at the top of page 2 of our text now. It says, we should arrive at a very precise understanding that the whole reason why sentient beings in this degenerate age are plagued by so much suffering is because they have such feeble powers of discernment, because we let ourselves get carried away with these thought patterns. I mean, look at the world we live in. It's just aflame with anger in many, many ways, right? Division and divisiveness. I mean, people, wars continue to go on, conflict goes on, individually, personally, as well as between family members and cities, towns, countries. Without a doubt, this is because of the fact that we don't have this good discernment to be able to look at things in a different way. So, he says, not to be hurt by the obstacles created by enemies, illness, or harmful influences does not mean to say that things like sickness can be driven away and that they will never occur again. Rather, it simply means that they will not be able to obstruct us from practicing on the path. Now, when he says this, he doesn't mean that there is no path that leads to the eventual removal of all these things, all of the suffering that we have to experience. He means rather that that should not be our goal. You don't practice mind training so that you simply have all these things disappear for you. You practice it so that you've got skills for when those things do come into our lives. They won't be obstacles then. They're going to be a great boon to our practice. They're not going to be something that gets in the way of our practice. So that's the idea behind it, is don't do it with the motivation of like, oh, if I become an expert mind trainer and work on all my thoughts, well, then all my problems go away. All those suffering things go away. Well, you won't see them through that habitual lens of being identified as problems and resisting them and so on. But they will still come into your life. You still will have things to work with, things that are challenging, things that are, going to trigger some painful moments in your life. That's just part of the nature of existence. So again, don't think that it means that they're going to go away, that they'll never occur again, rather that they won't be obstacles any longer. So this is the two thoughts. I kind of had introduced these a little bit last week, but I want to emphasize them now because we're going into this nice little section where we're going to kind of talk about these in a little more detail before we go on to the actual training. So in order for this to happen, we need first to get rid of the attitude of being entirely unwilling to face any suffering ourselves. And we should be putting out the welcome mat for suffering in a sense and saying, okay, here's some new suffering for me to work with. How wonderful. Get all excited about it. And second, to even cultivate the attitude of actually being joyful when suffering arises. So it's not just that we're not going to resist the suffering, we're going to even be delighted when suffering happens. I'm going to tell you my own little story of when I was, Venerable Rabina kind of reminded me of this at the Light of the Path retreat with Lama Zopa Rinpoche in North Carolina in 2016. It was early morning. We were going down to the Gompa for like the session that started at like 5:15, 5:30. So it's like really dark still, 5 or so in the morning. And this was the one morning throughout the whole retreat when it rained. And so I'm walking down, and I've got my umbrella and what have you. And I didn't see there was a dark part of the one path, and there was a little bit of concrete that was out of one of the blocks there on the pathway. And I tripped on it and fell forward. And the glasses I had at that time went into the side of my face here. You can still see a little bit of a scar there. This is my scar from the retreat in 2016. I've got another one. No, it's not like the red badge of courage or something. But anyway, so it like cuts the whole side of my face here. Luckily missed my eye, but anyway, so Venerable Rabina shows up at the retreat about a day after this happens. And of course, this is all still quite raw and what have you. And she's looking at me and I go, oh yeah, I fell the other morning going down to the Gompa. And she says, oh, congratulations. I can tell you honestly that was not my first thought when I fell. But I wasn't like, congratulations. This is like the most incredible gift that I've been given. But this is something that, again, if we are working on that, which I'm sure Venerable Rabina does, and that's our thought pattern, that when we hear about this or have to experience these sorts of things, that we actually think from that vantage point. How wonderful, you've been given this amazing opportunity. This karma has ripened and you now have this wonderful thing to work with. And I'm not advising that we say that to all of our friends when they come to us and they complain about having a problem. It's not like, oh, congratulations, you have this wonderful problem. That's not the right response in that regard. If it's another Buddhist practitioner or someone that we feel comfortable approaching that with, well, then certainly it's important that we remind people that that's how they ideally are supposed to practice. Like Venerable Rabina did to me, to make sure that I'm reminded that I need to see this as something that's actually quite positive. But again, when people come up to us who we don't know as well, or they're not practicing Buddhists or what have you, then that's the time for compassion. That's the time to really see them through the lens of their suffering and what they're going through and how challenging and difficult that is for them. But for ourselves, when we have those experiences, that's how we should be framing it. We should be saying, okay, I'm not going to see the suffering from that vantage point of just a problem and resist it. I'm actually going to even be joyful when I have this going on. I'm going to feel like, oh, I've won the lottery. Congratulations. This is the most wonderful thing that's happened. Again, challenging stuff. So let's take a look at what our author says more specifically about these two things. The first section, dropping the attitude of being entirely unwilling to suffer. So he says, think about all the depression, anxiety, and irritation we put ourselves through by always seeing suffering as unfavorable, something to be avoided at all costs. I mean, think about it. How much, how many brain waves we've spent thinking about, cogitating, recycling, all these things that go on, and the negative thoughts that we have about stuff, lying awake at night, not being able to sleep because we've been thinking about our problems purely from that vantage point. Now think about two things: how useless this is and how much trouble it causes, right? And we can see it for ourselves if we actually are, honest and looking at these experiences we've had. Go on reflecting on this repeatedly until you are absolutely convinced. He's going to talk about this in a little more detail. Then say to yourself, from now on, whatever I have to suffer, I will never become anxious or irritated. Go over this again and again in your mind and summon all your courage and determination. So he's going to talk about these 2 points in the next bit of the text. But this is the idea, is that we want to reflect on these points, how useless it is and how much additional torture it causes us, how unfavorable it is for us to actually be in that cycle. Again, that's second arrow stuff. The first arrow is going to happen. But if we continue to just be plagued by a mind that is angry and upset at everything that we're having to experience, well, then we're just torturing ourselves. First, let's look at how useless it is. If we can do something to solve a problem, then there's no need to worry or be unhappy about it. If we can't, then it doesn't help to worry or be unhappy about it either. This is the verse I mentioned in response to Leah's question at the end of last week, the wonderful verse from Master Shantideva. This is Stephen Batchelor's translation. Why be unhappy about something if it can be remedied? And what is the use of being unhappy about something if it cannot be remedied? So once more, we see the uselessness in terms of why we have this resistance to the problem. If you have a problem or difficulty in your life that is able to be solved, it's something you can do something about, well, then why are you putting all your energy into being disturbed about it? Put your energy into resolving it. The Buddha never said, don't resolve your problem. Sure, if there are things external to ourselves that we can do something about, well, by all means, do those things. Of course, don't harm other beings or people in the process of resolving problems. But if there is an ability for us to do something to rectify a situation, then our getting bent out of shape over it isn't really that productive, right? It's much more productive to put energy into resolving it. But of course, we also have the other side of it. What if it's something we can't do anything about? Now, again, when we say you can't do anything about it, we mean we can't change the external situation. That first arrow is going to be there, and we're going to have to experience it as it is. We can't do something to alleviate that pain or that difficulty. We don't mean that we can't do anything at all, because we can always do something. That's what we're learning in this course. We can always change our minds. But if we simply get kind of bent out of shape about something that we can't do anything about, like the reality of death, some people get horribly depressed just, hearing that thought, think about your own death. And we use that as a meditation in Buddhism a lot. People think, well, why should I meditate on that? It's something, that I'm going to have to experience it eventually. It brings them great pain or suffering to think about their own mortality. Can't do anything about that. Well, what use is it to then get fearful and anxious and stressful about it? It's going to come, and it's much better for your mind if you're calm, peaceful, and resigned yourself to that reality. So once more, I think that we have to see that there's some logic in what Shantideva is saying here. It's really futile for us to rally against something that can be changed, put your energy into changing it, and it's really ridiculous for us to rally against something that cannot be changed, or to have a mind that's angry and upset on the face of that, right? So this is, again, some pretty wise words, but this whole point is the first one, how useless it is for us to be that way. Then number two, the enormous trouble or harm involved. As long as we don't get anxious and irritated, then our strength of mind will enable us to bear even the hardest of sufferings easily. they'll feel as flimsy and insubstantial as cotton wool. I'm not sure what cotton wool is. Maybe it's a blend. But the idea is that it's something light, like if you think about a cotton ball or shreds of cotton or something, it becomes really light. The idea is that if we actually face up to those things that we do have to endure, that we can't do much to rectify, well, then we become really strong in our own resilience. Our place of vulnerability isn't so great, perhaps. We still are vulnerable to those pains and difficulties, but we don't drown in it. We don't get lost in it. We actually have some skill and ability that we can use at those times. And so things become insubstantial. But, he says, while we are dominated by anxiety, even the tiniest problem becomes extremely difficult to cope with because we have the additional burden of mental discomfort and unhappiness. Again, that second arrow. Why are we torturing ourselves with that second arrow? We're really good in a culture of like supporting each other in the second arrow stuff, right? People like to kind of commiserate with others and have other people validate why they feel so angry and upset at the first arrow. But there's not a lot of benefit to that. Again, it only stirs things up and keeps us in this place of anxiety, stress, what have you. So again, it's not very fruitful at all if we really, take a look at what these habits that we're doing. Now he's going to use an example. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this is at the bottom of page 2, an example around how it's similar with regard to attachment. Here we're talking about mainly anger and resistance in that way, but let's talk about the other delusion of attachment. He says, imagine, for example, trying to get rid of desire and attachment for someone we find attractive while continuing to dwell all the while on their attractive qualities. Or take anything, if it's not a person, something that you have as an object of attachment for you, be it, some object of the senses or what have you, something that you're attracted to. If you only dwell on the attractive qualities of that object, you're only going to support the mind of attachment arising, right? It makes sense. That's what attachment does. It clings to the desirable qualities and exaggerates their presence so that we then get stuck in that object. It's similar with regard to our mind of anger. If we look at only the negative qualities and the negative things and dwell on those and recycle them in our minds, well, then we're only going to have a mind that is perpetuating its anger as opposed to a mind that eventually becomes free of it. Again, he says it would all be in vain. In just the same way, if we concentrate only on the pain brought by suffering, we'll never be able to develop endurance or the ability to bear it. Now, I've put in the little footnotes that are in this. Sometimes they're pretty significant. Other times, I'm not sure. They add a little bit of meaning, perhaps. This is referring to the Tibetan term there, Zotran. I can't remember how that would be pronounced even in the Tibetan. My Tibetan is so lousy. The ability to bear suffering, forbearance, endurance, patience, fortitude, stability. Again, that's what we want to develop, is the ability to endure what is painful and difficult, those first arrows, and not exacerbate our suffering. So, he says, as in the instructions called sealing the doors of the senses, and I think this is probably instructions that were given originally in the Buddha in a sutra. Don't latch on to all kinds of mind-made concepts about your suffering. Learn instead to leave the mind undisturbed in its own natural state, bring the mind home, rest there, and let it find its ground. So what he's saying in this instruction, as far as I can tell, and looking at the Buddha's teachings of kind of not allowing our doors of our senses to go out, is that if we continue to be kind of intimately involved with everything that appears to our senses, well, we're only going to create that type of pattern that is looking outside of ourselves for happiness and well-being and then getting bent out of shape when those things don't materialize. These are the patterns that we ourselves find ourselves in, and they're certainly what most of the world is in. They look to things outside of themselves as the source of their happiness and well-being. If we seal the doors of the senses, if everything that we meet, we simply experience as what it is, as a raw experience, but we don't do anything about it in terms of our additional thoughts of attachment, anger, and so on, well, then we have a very powerful tool, a very profound place to work from, which is this place of being calm and still in ourselves and not being continually drawn out to these things. As I said, the first arrows are going to keep happening, and even the delightful stuff is still going to keep happening. All of this in our field of experience isn't going to stop. It's going to continue to be there. It's how do we relate to all those things? Do we get totally caught up in it? Do we just, get absorbed into everything that is happening in this sphere of experience? Or do we pay attention to our own minds, rest in that place of calm and not being so distracted, and actually do something meaningful? And we have that choice every day because we have sense objects, again, that we experience perpetually, and they're around us all the time, right? What are we doing with our minds in the midst of all of that happening? Okay, now we go on, I think, to the second of these points. This is at the top of page 3. Again, there's a little bit more from Rinpoche. Sorry, I forgot I put these in here. Identifying the harms you receive as problems has great shortcomings. Think of all the problems you've experienced in your life, then contemplate over and over again the result of seeing them only as problems. Has it benefited you or not? Try to see as clearly as possible the shortcomings of this attitude. And that's the first attitude that we need to overcome, seeing them solely through that light. Then generate a very strong positive motivation. Again, just like our author said, determining that from now on, no matter what problems I have to face, I won't become irritated by them. I won't identify any circumstances or obstacles I experience as problems. I'll regard them actually as positive. Generating this brave, determined attitude is extremely important for your thought transformation practice to succeed. So this is the first part of it, turning away from what we normally call suffering into something that we see as no longer an obstacle, actually something quite positive. Then secondly, cultivating the attitude of being joyful when suffering arises. I know this sounds like such a tall order. It is, but it's something that we can do. Let me take it off screen here for a moment before we go on, because I want to share one memory of Rinpoche that I wasn't there, but there were all these videos they posted after Rinpoche manifested the stroke back in April of 2011. Remember, he was in Australia, and there was these signs that he was having a stroke, and so they took him to the hospital and everything. There were some shots of him within a day or so of getting in the hospital, and he was just in this joyful space. He was just so delighted and like he was like a kid experiencing something for the first time. There was just this really wonderful delight in him that for most of us, if we had a stroke, we were in the hospital, we probably wouldn't be in that space, right? We wouldn't be like, oh, good. This is kind of interesting. What's going on with this? What kind of challenges can I, see and work with in regard to what's happening with my body right now? Again, I think we can see it in these amazing practitioners that they've developed that level of joy when suffering comes into their lives. Again, not something that I have, I freely admit it, but we work on it gradually, we'll get it. So the second point is seeing suffering as an ally to help us on the path. He says we must learn to actually develop a sense of joy when it arises, to actually be happy when we have that experience. When Rinpoche says on this, when you meet undesirable conditions, if you spontaneously recognize them as good, you will be happy. During times of criticism, poverty, difficulties, failure, sickness, or even imminent death, nothing will disturb your mind. You will be consistently happy. This goes back to what I was saying last week. We have this power in our minds to dictate what we are experiencing, that we see is more powerful because the external conditions can be very different than what we are experiencing inside. We can be going through the toughest times and actually have a very happy mind. Sometimes we can be going through wonderful times and have a very miserable mind. The mind dictates our experience more than the external conditions. So regardless of what's going on, if we choose to see it as something that brings joy and happiness, then that's what we'll be. Effortlessly, naturally, Rinpoche says, you will recognize the benefits of problems. And the more you see the benefits, the happier you will be to experience difficulties in your life. Again, sounds pretty outrageous, but this is what we're trying to do, these two attitudes. To transform problems into happiness, it is not sufficient simply to see that problems help your practice of virtue. This alone is not enough. You must clearly recognize that your problems are actually necessary conditions for your practice of virtue, and you can derive continual, stable happiness from this. I mentioned this last week. I think this is an important point, because otherwise you look at this practice as kind of something that's, oh, that's kind of nice to do, and maybe I'll do it on occasion, but it's not really essential. This is an essential practice to be able to transform everything that you meet that is in the nature of suffering into the path. And of course, our author also at the very end even talks about transforming what is happiness, those pleasant experiences, into the path. Because remember, His Holiness pointed out last week, I mentioned this, that those are the two times when our practice can really go astray. And we become intoxicated with pleasure and think everything is just fine, and we forget to practice. We become complacent. But we also, of course, have the main one we're working with in this course, which is when we have problems or difficulties, when we get upset, because that is discouraging for us and we don't have the strength to practice at those times. Well, this text is about how do we develop that? How do we actually not see them as problems and actually put out the welcome mat and see them as something very joyful in our lives? So, necessary to do this in order to have a mind that is trained so that when you get to your death or whatever happens in this life, whatever problems or difficulties you have to face, you've got something you can utilize. You have something that actually is, oh, good. Now I get to try this out. Now I get to work with this situation. Now I get to enrich my mind through this practice. Yeah, changes your whole attitude. So again, when I mentioned last week, one of the main different translations of this word lo, which we usually translate as mind in lojong, mind training, is thoughts, attitudes. We've got to change those. There's a wonderful verse also from chapter 6. By the way, chapter 6 of Shantideva's, if you don't know, is his chapter on patience, which of course is one of the qualities that we're developing as we learn to work with suffering, difficulty. In that chapter, in verse 17, he says, furthermore, suffering has good qualities. Through being disheartened with it, arrogance is dispelled. We're going to look at that. That's one of the points that our author raises, is how it overcomes our pride and arrogance. Compassion arises for those in cyclic existence. This is also a point our author makes that we will be talking about shortly, probably next week on that one. I won't get to that one quite yet. And then evil is shunned, negativity is shunned, and joy is found in virtue. This is also something I'm hoping to get to today. But this is kind of, again, even Master Shantideva telling us that our suffering is rich in opportunity. It has good qualities. Rather than being resistant to it, we need to, again, not have that mind, but also even become joyful when suffering comes into our lives. So this is kind of moving into this idea of the many teachings that he's going to go to that we'll go through one at a time for how to work with our suffering. Yet, whenever suffering strikes, he says, unless we have some kind of spiritual practice to bring to it, one which matches the capacity of our mind, no matter how many times we might say to ourselves, well, as long as I've got roughly the right method, I'll be able to use suffering and obtain such and such a benefit. You might have that kind of thought, well, I'll be able to, I'll manage, I'll do fine. He says it's highly unlikely, if that's your only thought, that you'll actually succeed. We'll be as far from our goal, the saying goes, as the earth is from the sky. So what he's talking about here is the fact that you can't actually just have this aspiration of, okay, I'm going to practice really well when suffering comes into my life, but not have the training to support it. There's that wonderful phrase, I always forget who it's from, some great Greek philosopher or whatever. He says, we don't rise to the level of our aspirations, we fall to the level of our training. Repeat that again. We don't rise to the level of our aspirations, meaning that when you meet something like a problem or difficulty in your life, you go to the doctor and are diagnosed with cancer or whatever the case might be, you don't say, oh, because I aspired to practice really well, I'm going to be just fine and everything's going to be hunky-dory. You fall to the level of your training, meaning that you will only be able to apply what you have trained in applying, what you have made yourself capable of applying. So that's why, once more, this whole set of teachings on transforming problems is couched in our study and practice of the Lam Rim, the stages of the path. That's the whole point of it, is that when we meet something, based on our prior training with refuge, renunciation, compassion, bodhicitta, all these wonderful things that are in the Lam Rim, then we have something we can do. When I was growing up, there was that, it's kind of a horrible show, but I was fascinated by it as a kid. Batman, the original Batman TV show. Batman had a utility belt, right? You know, like if he was going to climb up a building, then he'd take out the one thing that he throws up and goes up the side of the building or whatever. You need the boomerang, the bat boomerang or whatever. I don't know. Anyway, all these silly things. He had a utility belt, meaning that he had something ready to apply at any moment when he was facing a particular situation. That's what we're trying to train ourselves in, so that when something comes into our life, based on our prior training, our having that utility belt, we can bring that out and actually apply it. If you don't have the training to support that, if you don't have the background in the Lam Rim, which some of you listening to this may not feel that you have that, and I'm going to give you some advice on obtaining that. Certainly, if you were attending Geshe Sherab's classes on the Lam Rim, on the essence of refined gold, that wonderful text by the third Dalai Lama, then you have some exposure to the topics there. And no doubt, if you've been involved in Thupten Norbuling and FPMT for years, then you've come across and studied the Lam Rim pretty well. This is a way of bringing those teachings to life and utilizing them as something that has triggered a deeper understanding of them and practice of them by problems, by difficulties, by dealing with the stuff that comes up in our lives. I might mention this wonderful book that just came out last month. Kathleen McDonald, many of you know her. She was the author of How to Meditate. She's put together How to Meditate on the Stages of the Path, a really wonderful book that the little bit of time I've spent with it just came in a few days ago. It's really quite nice because she goes into enough explanation and deepening of the various teachings of the Lam Rim to be able to support someone using this as a meditation manual. So by all means, whatever you can find to help increase your awareness and understanding of the Lam Rim, that's really important for practicing mind training. If you don't have that as a support, again, you may aspire to practice really well when problems or difficulties come, but you're going to fall to the level of that practice or training. It's just what happens with our minds. Our minds are not going to be that capable. If you can imagine, I mean, we try to do, let's go back to that topic of death. We try to do a death awareness meditation as frequently as we can, even every day. Rinpoche says, when you wake up in the morning, be so happy that you have another day in the life of this wonderful human existence. But remember that you could die that day. In fact, Rinpoche says we should hold the thought, I will die today, so that we actually utilize that day well. Well, if death does come today, say, I want you all to be alive. I want you all to come back next Sunday and continue to be here in this wonderful human life. But if you were to die today, are you ready to work with your death? Especially if it comes in a very, quick way, a sudden way. Suddenly you're driving and there's this accident, horrible accident, and somebody careens into you, and those are your last moments. Do you have the strength of mind to be ready to meet that? And we're talking about just being ready to meet getting ill, having somebody be annoying to us, whatever, all these other problems. Death is a pretty big one, right? Are you ready for that? The Lam Rim is how we prepare for that, by grounding our minds in these teachings so that then when we meet difficult things, those are what come to mind, not these thoughts of it's a problem and blah, 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 blah. We are delighted because this is a reminder of what it is that we're practicing. And that's what we're going to see as we go through all of this, is that these suffering experiences become a touchstone for reminding us of what we are to practice. That's how we transform suffering into the path, into happiness. All right? So let's just review really quickly. We've got 3 levels of the stages of the path. We're going to get into this in a moment. I might be jumping ahead just a little bit, but the 3 levels of the stages of the path, we have some introductory topics once more, having met with the guru, having attained this perfect human life. Those are important contemplations to have every day, to recall our incredible good fortune with this human existence that we currently possess. The very first level of the path is to be concerned about what your next existence will be. And the main teachings there are refuge and karma, recognizing that we're going to die, that we're going to potentially go on to an unfavorable existence. We need to find a reliable refuge, something that will support us in our practice of the path. Yeah. And then we need to especially find refuge in the teachings on karma. because the teachings on karma are the backbone of the entire Lam Rim, especially at the level of determining what our future existence will be. So essentially, that's the first level, is to be concerned about your future life experiences at when this life ends. Secondly, we have the stages of the path that pertain to the big picture in regard to ourselves, what we call samsara, going from life to life. Yes, it's good to get a good rebirth, but wouldn't it be nice to be free of this cycle of existence? To be liberated once and for all? That's the level of motivation we bring there. And of course, one of the main driving forces there is this mind of renunciation, a mind that turns away from our experiences that we're having now, seeing them as faulty, as insufficient, as unsatisfactory, and moving towards a greater goal, a goal of peace, nirvana, liberation. The third level is the stages of the path pertaining to the greatest capacity, the greatest practitioner. And that's where we look at the big picture in regard to everyone, that we're not alone in our suffering, that every being in samsara is under the control of the same factors and having the same experiences as we are, essentially, going from life to life, never finding any real peace or satisfaction. That's when we generate bodhicitta, develop deep compassion and loving kindness for all beings, and engage in the practices that help us to achieve Buddhahood so that we can then help all of those beings. That's, again, just a brief overview of those three stages. What I've done is I've essentially structured the points that our author makes into those three levels as best as my estimation of those. He doesn't really do that. He presents them in a little bit different order. But I'm approaching it from that vantage point. The idea here is that we should practice applying whatever teachings we feel are kind of where we're at. I mean, yes, it's nice to practice all of them and get a taste for all of them. But if you've been meditating in particular on that first level, if this is where your practice is right now, is really to look at the teachings on karma and refuge and what have you, and to be aware of your own mortality and what might happen after death. All of those teachings are what you need to apply in your mind training then when you work with suffering situations. If you're practicing more on the middle level, well, then you would apply the teachings pertaining to renunciation and overcoming our pride and what have you. The third one, if you're at that level, that's where you're focusing on in your current practice, then try to apply those teachings. What happens then is it becomes kind of two things. We're doing our own practice of meditating on the Lam Rim on any of those three levels. That's enhancing our understanding of that. But then when we're meeting with problems and difficulties, we're deepening our practice of those. And it becomes mutual. Then we have greater tools to apply when problems arise. Then when we apply them, when those problems arise, we deepen our understanding. And it becomes a circle of practice. Those problems and difficulties enhance our deepening our study and practice of the Lam Rim, and so on. All right? That's the logic behind this. Let's go back to our text. And again, there's a little bit more, I think, before he actually starts to get into the individual topics, perhaps. A little from Rinpoche. I'm always forgetting everything I put in here in these slides, but I always, again, as I mentioned last week, try to quote Rinpoche when I can because his practice is so profound. It is essential, he says then, to be well prepared before actually meeting miserable conditions, since being able to use them as a basis for virtue and happiness is extremely difficult. With prior training, however, you can more easily apply the thought transformation practice you have been practicing. So if you've been practicing with reminding yourself of refuge, for example, which we're going to talk about today, well then, when you have a problem or difficulty, that's the time to go to those teachings and say, oh, this is reminding me of the fears of samsara and how I need to find a safe refuge that will protect me from those, and so on. Again, we'll see this coming up when we go through the individual points. Therefore, he says, use suffering as the basis for the following practices. This is on page 3. Now, I'm inserting a little preliminary advice. And this is on the basis of some comments from Rinpoche, but I think it's also very much in line with our Mahayana thought training. It's not mentioned by our author of this text, again, that we're using. But I think it's really wonderful to see suffering as the blessings of the gurus or Buddhas. This is kind of an initial framing of it that is similar to kind of the first thought that our author was talking about. Remember, he had two thoughts. One was to not see it as solely a problem or suffering, and the second one to actually be joyful when it arises. Well, this first one can be also embedded within the idea of what is happening to me now. I can actually choose to see as the blessings of the Guru or the blessings of the Buddhas. Now, what does that look like? Does that mean that the Buddhas and the Gurus want us to suffer? I don't think so. I don't think that that's how we are to take that thought, and to think that the Buddhas are throwing those first arrows at us out of a wish for us to be kind of struck by pain and anguish and what have you. I think what it means is we are going to see once more, in the same way that that verse I mentioned earlier about seeing the person who you've been very kind to, who actually does something mean and awful, as your most holy guru. This means framing whatever is happening to you as equivalent to a Mahayana guru appearing in your life. A guru who's giving you the instructions that will be beneficial for your mind. What does a Mahayana guru do for you? Exactly that, right? Tries to give you what will be useful to you to help you on your development. This is why we have a guru. Remember, the teachings on the guru are preliminary to these three stages, but they are the foundation of everything that we develop on the path. Relying upon a guru means seeing that whatever we're experiencing is kind of the blessings of the guru giving us this as an opportunity to practice. It changes our mind around it then. It helps to support that first thought of not seeing it solely as a problem or a difficulty, but actually seeing it as, oh, wow, the blessings of the guru. And then again, we can even generate that second thought, seeing some joy and happiness at that. I've been blessed by the guru to experience this. That's probably what Venerable Rabina meant when she said congratulations to me, right? You know, and it does happen often when we're in the presence of our gurus, such as at those retreats. It was like sometimes, I think it was one retreat they did 4 weeks, but they were mostly 2 weeks. But when you're in this intense environment with someone like Lama Zopa Rinpoche, sometimes stuff comes to the surface because of the power of those beings for us. So if things happen and you see it in that lens of this is the blessings of the guru, this is the guru giving me exactly what I need to ripen my own mind, well then why wouldn't you be delighted, right? Let's see what this is a text that Lama Zopa Rinpoche translated. A wonderful Kadam Geshe, one of these Kadampa Geshes were those who followed the mind training practices. This is Geshe Karag Gomchen. And it says, even just this small suffering finishes past bad karmas and causes happiness in future lives. Don't look at the suffering as negative. Rejoice. Be happy at the suffering. This suffering is the blessing of the guru. Experiencing suffering such as sickness becomes the cleansing of negative karma and defilements. If one experiences suffering such as sickness, it is the blessing of the guru because it purifies past negative karma and causes one not only to gain happiness, but to actualize the path to obtain realizations. And those are Rinpoche's words in the parentheses there. I didn't add those. This is, again, why we are using this thought of seeing our problems or our difficulties as the blessings of the guru. So the guru is now giving us this wonderful opportunity for our karma to ripen, our past negative karma that has ripened into that suffering experience. And we can then say that that karma is exhausted, that karma is done. And we get to utilize that moment of suffering as a wonderful doorway for realizing the path. That's the blessings of the guru. I think it's a really powerful way to frame it and to kind of look at it. Again, once more, not something that we should be doling out to everyone else. You know, somebody comes, oh, my partner divorced me and da-da-da-da and all this. Oh, the blessings of the guru. You know, they're going to look at us like we've got horns on our head, right? You know, it's not the kindest thing to say to someone if they aren't ready to hear it. But if you are working with each other or working with other people who practice the Dharma, it's good to remind them that that is how they should ideally be seeing those situations. It's the blessings of the Guru, the blessings of the Buddhas. I have a little quote from Lama Zopa Rinpoche next, I think, on the next slide. It says, when you have when you have a problem, think this is the blessing of the Buddha. This situation is purifying me by exhausting my negative karma and by helping me to train my mind in Mahayana thought transformation so that I can achieve enlightenment for the sake of all beings. I welcome this problem as an opportunity for me to train my mind. And this is already setting out those same 2 points that we talked about, not seeing it solely as suffering, seeing it as something to be happy and joyful about. And we can do that primarily by seeing whatever is happening as like, oh, this is a gift from the gurus. This is a gift for me to be able to work with this. How wonderful. All right. Now, what I've done in terms of structuring this so that we can cover, all of these points in a more kind of structured way with regard to the Lam Rim is that I've taken 3 pieces of advice that our author presents, and I'm summarizing them in terms of advice pertaining to teachings of the small scope. Remember, the small scope, or the person of the least capacity, is the person who's at least aspiring to know about karma, develop a deep sense of refuge, so that they can have a good rebirth, so that they can be free from the unfortunate states and so on. Again, doesn't mean that taking refuge and attending to our karma, that these are not teachings that are relevant throughout the entire 3 scopes of the stages of the path. It just means that this is where they are presented. Remember, at the very first teaching in the small scope, we have 4 main teachings in the small scope. The very first one is death, that we have to experience the end of this life. It will come at a time that's uncertain, and what will be most important is the degree to which we've worked with our minds. That's what we'll be able to rely upon when death actually comes, as I was saying earlier today. We have the second topic of that small scope, which is the unfortunate states. That if we don't tend to our karma and create the causes, then at the end of this life, we could end up in one of those unfortunate states. The one that we have the most direct experience of course, is the state of animals, all these wonderful little creatures that inhabit the earth with us, right? We could end up in that state very easily if we haven't tended to this life well. The third and the fourth teachings are the teachings on refuge and karma. Based on these fears, especially a fear of the lower realms, then we need to generate some confidence that there's a source of support to protect us from those. That the 3 jewels, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, can actually help us to avoid that unfortunate rebirth. And therefore, once more, we tend to the teachings on karma. Karma being the most instrumental teachings in terms of shaping our future experience, our next life, but again, a relevant teaching throughout the stages of the path. So we have item B, which is on page 3, using suffering to train in taking refuge. And then the other 2 pertain to karma, D and E, using suffering to purify our harmful actions and to find joy in positive actions. All right, let's go to the first topic. Our author says, in regard to using this in terms of transforming a problem or a difficulty, say to yourself, life after life, again and again, we are continuously plagued by these kinds of fears. And the one and only protection that can never fail us is the precious guide, the Buddha, the precious path, the Dharma, and the precious companions on the way, the Sangha, the 3 jewels. So remember that these 3 jewels are the source of protection from our fears. The 2 causes of refuge are those: having some fear or trepidation about something we have to experience, which at the first level of the stages of the path is our next rebirth that could be unfortunate. At the second level of the stages of the path is continuing to be in samsara. At the third level of the stages of the path is a greater fear for the suffering of all sentient beings, not wanting them to suffer. Whatever it is that we have some fear or trepidation, that's the starting point. So once more, we're not talking about not acknowledging that we have suffering. We do acknowledge we have suffering. We do have some trepidation or fear about our future experiences in samsara. But we're going to choose to use those to enhance our refuge by having that fear, and then secondly, developing a deeper confidence that the 3 jewels can help you to be free from that. This is what the topic of refuge is all about, generating some conviction, some deep faith. We even use this word faith in Buddhism, but it's really a faith that is grounded in confidence that the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha are the way out. They're the exit from samsara and from all of our suffering for all beings. The Buddha being the enlightened beings who teach the Dharma, the main method for becoming free from samsara and achieving enlightenment. And then, of course, the Sangha, the spiritual community that have practiced these teachings to a greater degree than ourselves that we can rely upon. So again, those are the 2 main causes: some fear or trepidation of some future suffering for ourselves or others, and then secondly, a confidence that the three jewels can protect us from that. So when we have a suffering experience, what it means then is we're going to say, okay, I've got this reminder that there is something that is generating some fear or trepidation in me that I should be concerned about. I should be wanting to have some resolution to. Therefore, I have to renew my placing my confidence in the three jewels. And that's how I live my life, kind of reminding myself of my refuge whenever problems or difficulties are happening. It was kind of interesting when I was talking to, I think it was somebody I was talking to, it could have been even a teaching, I can't recall now, but when the pandemic first started, I was saying how this pandemic does remind you where your actual refuge is. If you think about it, is our refuge in everything going well outside and always, having the perfect conditions? And because remember, when the pandemic started, it was like a whole new experience of being limited in what we could do and having to mask up and to do all these various things, that were just totally foreign to us. Where was our refuge? Is your refuge, if your refuge is always in the external and in everything being good and wonderful and delightful, well, then you're going to be miserable. If your refuge is in the three jewels and in your own desire to follow the Dharma to the deepest degree, well, then you always have that, regardless of what's going on, right? Doesn't matter if there's a pandemic or a tsunami or an earthquake or whatever is happening, right? You have your refuge. So that's the idea behind this first one. Let's share a little bit more of our text and then a few words from Rinpoche on this. Our text says then, so it is on them, the three jewels, that I must rely entirely. Whatever happens, I will never renounce them. Let this become a firm conviction and train in the practice of taking refuge. I know this sounds like very simplistic, but this is what we mean. When you're having problems or difficulties, do you turn to the three jewels for refuge? Do you begin to apply the Dharma and some of the other teachings even that we have, much less, take refuge? So Rinpoche says, you must think there are uncountable results of past karma I have yet to experience, oceans of samsaric suffering. Only the triple gem, and Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, have the power to liberate me from all true suffering and the true cause of suffering. And since the triple gem has the power to liberate me completely from all samsara, why not from these problems that I am experiencing now? Again, it doesn't mean that the Buddha is going to come down and our problem goes away. It means that this is going to be a chance for us to renew our refuge, to place our refuge very strongly, especially in the Dharma. Therefore, no matter how difficult my life is, I won't give up refuge in the triple gem. No matter how many problems I have, I won't give up Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Use your problems in this way to train your mind in refuge and strengthen your reliance upon the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So I like putting this kind of first. Well, I mean, again, we had the thought of seeing it as the blessings of the Guru as a preliminary thought. But putting refuge first also reminds us that whatever other teachings we might apply, those other ones in the small scope and the middle scope and the great scope that we're going to go through as part of this course, they're all what we mean by taking refuge. In fact, Lama Yeshe, according to Venerable Connie Miller, who was resident teacher here many, many years ago, she's teaching over in Italy now, where she's been quite a while. Anyway, she says that Lama Yeshe used to use the phrase doing refuge, not taking refuge. And I kind of like that because, again, what does doing refuge mean? Doing means that we are doing something at the time that is about finding refuge in the three jewels, finding them as our ultimate source of protection from our suffering. So once more, this is about trying to bring to mind that that is how we should be living our lives. That is what it means to be a Buddhist. That's the identification of what a Buddhist is. A Buddhist is someone who has taken refuge in the three jewels. Of course, there's also philosophical concepts we should be kind of prescribing to on the basis of that refuge. But that's the heart of it, is that we are looking to the three jewels as our source of protection. Once more, especially the Dharma. The Buddha is our ultimate refuge because the Buddha is what we strive to become and is also the being who has fully perfected themselves. But the Dharma is the real protection for us right now because that's how we're going to actually get to Buddhahood and even become a Sangha jewel along the way, somebody who has realizations who can help others on their path. You don't get there by, again, not applying the Dharma, by not taking the medicine of the Dharma. So when we have a problem or difficulty in our lives, this is a good place to start. We might initially see it once more as the blessings of the Guru. Oh, how wonderful. I get this amazing opportunity from the Guru to practice with my mind. Then secondly, say, and this is a reminder of how much I need to deepen my refuge, how much I need to hold the Dharma as the most precious thing, regardless of what's happening in my life. And never go against the Dharma. Always try to hold my practice of the Dharma purely. Wonderful thought to kind of start with. Let's go on then to the second teaching that pertains to teachings in the small scope, the initial stages of the path. Using suffering to purify harmful actions. So now our author says, this is point D at the bottom of page 3. He says, remind yourself and realize all this suffering which I'm going through, and suffering which is greater still, all the boundless suffering that there is, come from nothing but harmful negative actions. This is developing once more that confidence in not just the Dharma in general, but the specific teaching on karma. That karma is the instrument by which we have experiences in our life. And so central to all of what we do in the path. But at the very first level, especially central to the experiences of suffering we have in this life and future lives, and trying to tend to our karma so that we can alleviate our suffering to some degree. So then our author says, reflect carefully and thoroughly on what are generally called the general characteristics or main characteristics of karma, these 4. The very first one, how karma is certain. Cause and effect is infallible. Let me talk about that one in general before we go on to each of these. That karma is certain or definite means that it is definite that if you produce an unfavorable karma, a negative karma, such as killing a sentient being or stealing from others or lying to others, you will experience a suffering result. There's no mixing of the results. If it's a particular type of cause, then the result will be in line with that cause. If you produce the virtuous act of refraining from killing others, saving their lives, protecting the possessions of others, speaking honestly, truthfully, all those positive karmas, you will experience happiness. There's no mixing of results. Don't do something that's virtuous, wholesome, and then get a suffering result from it. Suffering results come from negative karma. Positive happiness results come from wholesome karma, virtuous karma. That's the very first of these 4 characteristics. Because karma is a subject that is a little hard to get our heads around because we don't see it in front of our eyes, that a particular action leads to a particular result. Our actions often take a long time for them to even ripen. And that comes to point number 2, that karma multiplies enormously. Sometimes use the phrase karma expands. The action that you do today, like let's just talk about us being here in this room, engaging in hopefully having virtuous thoughts while I'm going blah, blah, blah. You're having a virtuous thought that you're planting on your mental continuum. That is going to ripen into happiness for you, but it may ripen into unbelievable happiness because it will take time for that to ripen. And over the course of that time, karma will expand, it will multiply. This is how we can achieve results such as Buddhahood on the basis of even simple little acts, such as like giving a few morsels of food to an animal. We can make that into a cause that will lead to our enlightenment because karma expands, it grows. Now, of course, on the other side, the negative karma, that's where we need to be particularly attentive to that reality, that you can create something that is very, very slight, very, very small, just maybe one little moment of anger towards somebody, that little moment of anger, if it's not purified, increases over time and becomes potentially the result of a life in a hell realm for eons, unbelievable results. I'm not trying to freak you out. I'm trying to just make you aware of this reality. This is how karma works. Now, one student asked, I think this was maybe even, I don't remember who was asked this, Rinpoche or someone, why does karma expand? It's just the way it works. In the natural law, we see some level of expansion, though it might depend upon other factors. Like if you take an apple seed and you plant it in the ground, if it has the proper conditions, it will grow into an apple tree, which produces bushels of apples every year, right? And creates a huge bounty from just something that is that small, right? A little apple seed. Yes, it requires these other conditions, Our karma doesn't require anything other than time. You plant it on your mind, and if it remains there, then something negative that is very small can give rise to something that is huge in terms of results. Something that is positive that is quite small can give rise to something that is huge in terms of positive results. This is just the way karma works. There's a little footnote on one of these. Let me go back to that screen. After karma multiplies enormously, there's a quote from Alec Zenkar Rinpoche. I don't know who this lama is. You might complain, I didn't do anything bad or very little in this life. So why do I go through such suffering? It's easy for karma to increase, just as how from a tiny seed in the earth, a lot of fruit can grow. The results of one action or karma can multiply enormously as they themselves spawn further consequences like a family tree. So again, that's just the rule of how things work. 3 and 4 kind of work in tandem. 3 is you will never face the effects of something you have not done. In other words, results are not achieved without their causes being there. And 4, whatever you have done will never go to waste. In other words, if the cause is there, then the result will inevitably come. Again, unless there's some interruption to that karma. So again, karma is embedded within this idea of cause and effect. And so if we want the effect, you have to have the cause. If you don't want the effect, don't create the cause, right? It's essentially the rules that we have to abide by. Every cause we create will create its results eventually, unless again, there's some interruption. Just like if you take that apple seed and you put it out in the field, and then maybe some insects or something get to it, right? They destroy it so that it's no longer there, the potency is gone, the whole tree doesn't develop. Well, we can do that with negative karma by purifying it, but we can also damage our positive karma by moments of great anger or other strong delusions. So we have to be tending to these two principles in regard to how karma functions too. If you don't want to create the result, you don't want to experience a result, well, then don't create the cause. Or if you do want to experience a result, do create the cause, because the result depends upon the cause being there. But if you've created the cause, recognize that the result is going to come. And tend to that as best as you can as well. Let's go through just a few comments from Rinpoche on this. He says, think in this way. 1, I have created negative karma, so I will definitely experience its results. That's the first of the 4 general characteristics that I went through. It's definite in terms of what it will result in. Negative karma will result in suffering. The reason I have been experiencing these problems again and again for such a long time is that karma can expand. It can grow with time if it is not purified. And he's mainly focusing on negative karma here, but these principles apply even for positive karma. Number 3, everything in my life now has a cause. For instance, from committing sexual misconduct in the past, my relationship is full of quarrels now. And if I had practiced the perfections of virtue and morality in the past, my life would now be happy and harmonious. Because I have not created this good karma and have instead created bad karma, I am suffering now. So once more, if you want to experience the results, guess what, folks? You need to create the cause. That's just how things work. Works that way in our physical world. Why wouldn't it work that way karmically? And then number 4, finally remember that karma is never lost. Even though it may be 100 eons before you experience the results, the karma you have accumulated never disappears. When the right time and perfect conditions occur, the karma will ripen and you will experience its effects. All right? So that's the 4 general characteristics. That's the first thing that our author says that we should be reflecting upon when we have an experience of suffering in our lives. Oh, this is definitely from my own past negative actions. It has been the product of that accumulation of that energy over time through the increase of karma. If I don't want to experience that result, then I have to stop creating the cause. And since I've created the cause, it is definite now that I'm experiencing that result. It reminds you of how karma works. And then, as he says on the screen here, say to yourself, so if I really don't want to suffer anymore, then I must give up the cause of suffering, which is negativity. So once more, I'm not going to read the full footnote on this one. Once more, I don't think that we're ever saying, when we say we don't want to, that first thought is not seeing our suffering as a problem, we're still identifying it as suffering, and that's the basis upon which we're going to transform our thoughts. What we're saying in this applying the teachings on karma in regard to that is that that suffering experience is a result of my own past actions. Therefore, this is a reminder for me to tend to my actions meticulously, to avoid the 10 non-virtues in particular. What I will do is I will put out on the handouts page at the course materials link the little bit booklet that FPMT has about the 10 non-virtues and the results. And if you have certain results in your life, you can identify what you did to create those. You can begin to attend to those actions more and so on. But this first part of it is to remind us that we are the creators of our own experience. If you don't want to suffer, which eventually, I mean, that is the goal once more, is to get rid of all suffering. If we don't want to have that unsatisfactory experience, we have to stop creating the causes for it. Tend to our karma, again, meticulously. The other part of this has to do with purification. And that's, to remind us that we should be purifying the negative karma that we have created. There, our author says, with the help of what are often called the four opponent powers, here just abbreviated to the four powers, make an effort to acknowledge and purify all the negative actions you have accumulated in the past, and then firmly resolve to avoid doing them in the future. For this, I will put a little practice from Venerable Rabina out on the website in the handouts section that you can do, Vajrasattva practice, that's applying these four opponent powers. Most of you know these, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on them. But once more, this just should be part of our daily practice. To use these four opponent powers to purify anything, particularly that we've done that day. If you do this at the end of the day, it's very powerful. You can say, okay, I kind of, was miserable with that person and said things I regret and da-da-da-da. Go through the list of things that you've done that day, as well as anything, particularly strong things you've done in this life. And generate first a regret or remorse. That's not guilt. It's not feeling horrible that you did this. It's saying, okay, I acknowledge that through the force of my crazy, deluded mind, I've done these things. And I regret that I did them because in the process, I've harmed others and I've certainly harmed myself. Secondly, reliance, which includes generating the mind of refuge, which we just spoke about, and the mind of bodhicitta, which you're familiar with, the wish to benefit all beings through becoming a Buddha. These kind of begin the repairing of our relationship to the three jewels and to all sentient beings by reestablishing that our protection is refuge. And we're going to rely upon that and the mind that wishes to benefit other beings to purify our negativities. Then we generate a remedy or antidote, which can be reciting Vajrasattva mantra, can be reciting the Heart Sutra, can be doing prostrations, can be doing an act of generosity or kindness, meditating on compassion. There are myriad numbers of antidotes or remedies, anything that is virtuous that you can kind of put as a force to counteract the negativity you've engaged in. And then the fourth one, perhaps the most important, is the resolve to not do those actions again to the best of your ability. If it's something like, I will never kill another being, and you can make the commitment to never intentionally kill another being in this life, then make that commitment. But if it's something you need more time to work with, then say, okay, I won't lie to others for the next 6 hours or 2 hours or 2 minutes or however long you need to work with it. And then try to keep expanding that time. So most of you, again, have some familiarity with this. And as I said, I'll post a little practice from Venerable Rabina on the Vajrasattva purification practice that includes all four opponent powers with a brief description of how you apply them in regard to that practice. This should be part of our daily practice. Rinpoche says we're insane if we don't purify every day. That it should be absolutely a given that at some time in your day you engage in some form of purification. That's how we remove all those negative seeds. It's like the bird, or worms or whatever, getting them out of the ground. Let's stop there. I could go on to the last part of this. It has to do with positive actions, but we're getting close to our time up, and I want to allow time for a question or two. Any questions or comments? And especially, again, we've talked about three things: blessings of the guru, refuge, and then, of course, seeing it as a way to purify our negative karma. Yes, Susan, online. If you can unmute, please.
Yes, thank you. Seeing negativity as a condition of being unvirtuous and immoral, that previous definition. How, I'm confused about how we translate karma in a situation of extreme suffering, like when people are trapped in a war zone, let's say like Gaza, you see an entire family blown away in front of you. How can you, first of all, how can you avoid suffering in something that intense? But second of all, how could that be a condition of that person's negativity? In other words, unvirtuous, immoral. I mean, do you see what I'm getting at? How could you say to that person, well, you were unvirtuous and immoral, therefore you're in this situation, deal with it?
Right, right. I know what you're saying, Susan, and this question comes up invariably when we talk about karma, because once more, and I don't know if this completely resolves it. I'm going to talk a little bit more than just saying this, but one of the ways that I emphasize this way of working with karma is that karma is an explanation, not a justification. And let me clarify what I mean by that. If we were to explain how an apple tree grows, right, in the way that we did of like the seed, and then of course you need the water and the sunlight, the nutrients in the soil, and all of this happens, and then you get an apple tree, and then you tend to the apple tree every year so that it makes sure that it produces many apples and what have you. We'd all be quite fine with that because it appears fairly neutral, right? We're just talking about the law of cause and effect in terms of how we want to explain, growing an apple orchard and having those trees available for you to receive the fruit from them. When we start talking about karma, of course, we're talking about cause and effect in regard to the experiences of beings. And when I say it's an explanation, what I mean is it does explain why there is suffering in the world. There is suffering in the world, whether we talk about the intense suffering that's going on in Gaza, or whether we talk about the suffering of somebody who loses some money on Wall Street, who's a billionaire. All of those are forms of suffering. And the Buddha says that the explanation is that they engaged in negative actions which have ripened into that result. It's an explanation. And why I say then, go on to say it's not a justification, is because I think we tend to hear teachings on karma as like a reward and punishment system. And it's not a reward and punishment system. It's a simple law of cause and effect. It's a way that we can explain this is the cause of why this is happening. And we have a linear way of examining that. Not that it's completely linear, because obviously there are many factors playing a role in all of this. But I know this, I get why people feel this way. And Venerable Rabina, sometimes when she's confronted with this question, I think one of the times she was here, she was teaching at Immaculate Heart of Mary Retreat Center, and there had just been this really horrific incident of a young child who was tortured and what have you by their family, and then starved to death or whatever. And I mean, it was just really horrific to hear about it. It just breaks your heart when we see the suffering that happens in our world. And in these situations where we look at somebody and think, how could that possibly happen to them? How could they have created all of those negative causes that would have resulted in such a horrific result? And Venerable Robina's point, I'm not trying to be flippant about things, because it's kind of interesting. We always think that in regard to bad things, but we never question it in regard to good things. Why do good things happen to people is the same explanation for why do bad things happen to people. But we tend to not go there. Why? Because our default mode is to think that everything should be good for ourselves and for others, and that when things are askew and these horrific things happen in our world, that there's something wrong then. Well, the reality is it's all a product of the same mechanism. But we tend to focus on the negative things, and we also get really bent out of shape, particularly when we see innocent people who are suffering, right? But innocent is, again, more in that vein of a justification, or not feeling that it's justified, that these beings who are in that particular situation should be suffering from such negativities that they committed in the past. So once more, we're simply looking at it as an explanation. From the vantage point of our own suffering, we can then begin to understand the mechanism by which we have to experience these sorts of results, as we were doing in looking at this topic. When it comes to observing it in other people, though, once more, we can have that understanding and explanation, but it should break our hearts. It should make us even more compassionate and even more driven to help those beings. Why? Because I don't have the verse in front of me, but one of the verses from Master Shantideva says, sentient beings don't want to suffer, yet they run towards its causes. Sentient beings want to be happy, and yet they flee from its causes. So if we understand the mechanism of karma as an explanation for why beings experience suffering or happiness, and how through the force of their ignorance of the law of cause and effect of karma, they are actually creating the causes for exactly what they don't want to experience. They are creating the causes for more misery, and they are ceasing to create the causes for their happiness through all of their misguided actions. Well, it should break our hearts. Again, we should become more and more intent on wanting to benefit them. So it's, I don't know, maybe I can hear what your comments are, Susan, on the basis of what I've said already, or if you have an additional question, you can unmute. Yeah, please.
Yes, additional question, and thank you for that explanation. That makes sense. But then it comes up the question for me, what about collective karma? We hear about that too. We read about that. How does that interact with, does it trump individual karma? You know what I mean? Does it outweigh
Right,
individual
right.
karma? Let's say in a war zone, something, activities of between nations, which we as individuals have no control over. You know, I
Sure.
mean, it just happened that the leaders of the country, whether we wanted them to do it or not. And so we're trapped in the collective karma that is
Yeah.
generated by these huge actions. And what would you say to let's say to a child or an adolescent who has suffered through this kind of a war and seen their whole family horribly destroyed, and they
Right.
come out of it with PTSD, how would you talk to them about karma?
Yeah, that's a really
We're
tough
supposed
one
to
because
care about the suffering of others. I mean,
yeah.
sometimes I get trapped in that thinking we're supposed to
Hmm.
care about the suffering of others, and yet we have this. I mean, sometimes it seems to
Hmm.
me we have a tendency just dismiss it. Well, it's just karma. How's that caring
Right,
about their
right,
suffering?
right. So let me answer that part first, and then we'll go back and talk about collective karma. And just may have to cut some of this a little short because I don't want to keep people here too late. But certainly, when it comes down to our job, if you will, as practitioners of Buddhism who have acquired knowledge around various topics, particularly karma, is to some degree to share those teachings with others. Once more, though, we have to recognize that there's this concept in Buddhism we call skillful means, which you won't really possess at the optimal degree until you're enlightened. That's part of why we have this wish to become a Buddha, so we can benefit others, because we don't have the ability to know exactly what other people might need to hear or what we might need to say to them in order to affect their minds. So we have to be pretty careful. I mean, when we grow up in a culture, particularly in the West, where teachings on karma, I mean, I hear some of the things that go on culturally around karma, and it's kind of, it's so lopsided, right? It's really just looking at like, oh, they'll get theirs, the karma's a bitch, all these kinds of phrases that people throw around. And it's only looking at it from the negative point of view and not recognizing the fullness of karma as the tool by which we experience all the happiness to enlightenment, and of course the misery all the way to the deepest hell realms or what have you. So once more, there's a distortion of karma that we have to deal with that's kind of happening culturally that makes it hard to just throw that out. I remember, I think it was Sharon Stone started saying something about karma on one interview that she had, and she was lambasted by so many people because they felt it was so inappropriate. It's a balancing act. How do we actually convey some of this information to others in a way that will be a benefit to them? Well, I think we just have to be attentive to what serves their needs at that time. If somebody is actually suffering in that moment and simply needs the comfort of somebody identifying with their suffering, being empathic, wishing for them to not suffer, doing what they can to alleviate that suffering through medicine and food and whatever else will be a benefit to them, that's the most appropriate response. To give them the Dharma, which will help them on their path, is rare and very difficult to do. And once more, we don't have the ability and skillful means to always be able to do that. I even look at myself as a Dharma teacher. I can sit here and talk about the Dharma based on the teachings I've had from all of my teachers, but I don't know what every one of you needs to receive in terms of teachings. I don't know your minds. I don't have that ability. So I throw out the teachings that I think will be a benefit. But when you're working with others, certainly who don't have a background in karma, it's really important that we obtain some level of permission to even approach that type of topic. because once more, so many people are going to be resistant to it. And the worst thing we can do is turn them off to the Dharma so that they turn away from it. And who knows how long that may go on, you know. They do say sometimes it's better to have some experience with the Dharma than have no meeting with it at all. But I still feel like if we think that what we're going to say is going to be of use to them and we want to offer it, then we should approach them from that vantage point. Say, you know, I have a perspective that comes from my spiritual tradition as to some of this that might be of use to you, but I don't want to share it unless you feel that that's something you're really ready to approach. Some people may be open to that. Some people may not. You can maybe even find other more skillful ways of getting some of it across, like saying, well, did you think about this, or did you think about that, or have you thought about why this happened, or what have you? I think it's very hard, though. So we're stuck in that place of like, okay, we really want to have this intention to benefit others and to bring them the Dharma and help them to know what are the causes of their suffering and their happiness so they can make better decisions. But are we really capable of doing that? That's why Lama Yeshe, in one of his last teachings on bodhicitta, he says, bodhicitta is the answer to that dilemma, in a sense. We want to help others so much more than we possibly can. Well, we need to develop ourselves then. We need to keep putting that energy back into working on our own minds, working on developing our greater capacity and ability so that we can help others. So that's maybe some type of answer to that question. I don't think it's that easy, Susan, to always be able to say, you know, this is exactly what I should say or what might be of use to this person, because we simply don't have that ability all the time. The whole thing of collective karma, let's start with that next time, and I'll talk a little bit on collective karma and individual karma and how those operate. And if there were any other questions from today, please write them down again, and then we will make sure to get them at the beginning of next week. Sorry, I'm teaching a lot and not giving as much time for questions. I'll try to correct that in the future. All right. Maybe let's go ahead and put the prayers on the screen then, if you could do that for us, Shayla. That would be great. Oh, you'll be doing it. Okay. Lou is doing it. Thank you, Lou. Oh, okay. All right, so let's do these wonderful prayers from Master Shanti Deva's text, kind of with that in mind, that we are seeing all the suffering that's going on in our world, and we ideally want all of it to be relieved, but we recognize that the source of suffering is within ourselves. The source of our happiness is within ourselves, and we want that strong aspiration for all beings to find those causes of happiness and suffering, to be able to affect their own welfare as quickly as possible. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. And for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Gangri Rawe Korwe Jinkam Dir Pendang Dewa Malu Zhongwei Ne Tenre Sikwan Tenzin Gyatso Yi Jape Site Bardu Tengurchi. And then we make strong prayers for the swift return of Lama Zopa Rinpoche. You can go ahead and take that off then, I think, Lou. Again, recognizing how important it is that we have Lama Zopa back in a form that we can be guided by, and he can guide other sentient beings in this world. We make prayers for his swift return. We also make prayers for any beings that we're holding in our hearts right now, sending out this positive energy to share with them so they can be free from their suffering immediately and have all the causes that will help them to achieve perfect happiness. And may all beings have these same benefits through what we've done here today. So again, just real quick, in terms of what I would encourage you to do over this week then is start to work with these three ideas, whichever ones appeal to you in terms of your own practice. Seeing what's happening in terms of any problem or difficulty as the blessings of the Guru, reminding you of your refuge in the three jewels, reminding you of the negative karma that must have been created by yourself to experience that. And reminding of the four general characteristics as well as a need to purify negative karma and engage in purification on the basis of that. And then next week we'll carry on and continue through these steps and additional tools for our utility belt that we can use. All right, everyone be well, have a good week, or again, if things happen negative, work with them as best as you can. All right, blessings to you all. We'll see you. Okay.